Hello and welcome. This video is to give you a basic overview of the perfect tense in Koine Greek, that is the language of the New Testament. In this video we are going to cover the perfect tense in the indicative mood, that is the most basic form of verbs where the basic verbal action is indicating something that's going on. Today we will cover only the active voice. We will come back to looking at middle and passive in the perfect tense. I will give you a few examples of perfect words from the New Testament, and I will also mention briefly the pluperfect tense, which is a separate form of the perfect tense. It only occurs 86 times with 31 different words in the New Testament, so we won't spend a lot of time on it, but I will just mention it. So before we start learning how the perfect is formed, let us think about what tenses actually mean. Tenses are about where on the timeline things happen, and we should also think about what sort of aspect they have, as in, are they continuing? Is there an outcome? Is there a progression? What are the consequences and resultant actions of a verb? Tenses give us an inflection. That means it's giving us the details that communicate to us the sense of timeline and where the verb action is happening with regards to the times of events. So their main groups are past, present and future, which is fairly self-explanatory, but there's several tenses within those, and some of the ways that these perform are specific to Greek and New Testament Greek and to ancient Greek that we'll just go through here. Starting with the most simple one, the present tense is what is happening now. In Koine Greek, unlike in English and other modern languages, this is always continuous. Where the present tense is used, it will always be continuous. There may be some sort of progression, there may not be, but it will always be continuous. If the writer wanted to state a once-off event, they would use an aorist. Although that is usually used as a past tense, it is sometimes used in the present. The future is about the things that are yet to happen, the things that will happen in future. In Koine Greek, the aspect of the future tense is not really communicated. You might understand it from the context, but we won't get it from the actual morphology of the words. That's the form the word takes. So it could be an event that happens once in the future. It could be an event that is in the future that is progressive or continuous, ongoing, or runs for a period and then stops. Those sorts of things aren't communicated. It just basically tells us that the verb action is in the future. The aorist can be used in the present to make a singular statement about a once-off action of that verb in the present, and that distinguishes it from the present tense, which is usually continuous. Normally the aorist is a past tense, but it will be clear when you see this, it will be alongside a present tense verb, and it will be clear that it is being used in that way. Most of the time when the aorist tense is being used, it is a once-off event in the past. The aorist sometimes gets used with the imperative mood and with participles, where it is clear that it is in the present tense, but normally, and in the indicative case, when we see an aorist, we will translate it as a once-off past event. The aorist doesn't have a clear aspect because it doesn't tell us any more information than the once-offness of the verbal event. It's as in, what are the outcomes of that? What are the resultant effects of that? It simply says that something has happened once in the past. The imperfect is a tense that has begun in the past and is continuing and it is still continuing. It is a continuous tense. So we often translate it by saying they were doing something, and we convey with words like were and doing that it started in the past, but also that it is continuing. It's imperfect, it hasn't been completed. Whereas the perfect tense, which we're going to be looking at today, is something that started in the past and has been completed. It might have been completed in the past, it might have been completed at any point right up until the present, but it is completed. And the pluperfect is another event that happens before another past tense verb in the timeline of events. So it is a form of perfect, but it has happened before something else happens, which is in the past tense. So it could come before an aorist, it could come before a perfect, it could come before an imperfect. That it doesn't matter which one. It is simply an event that happened before the other past tense verb. And it might be in the same sentence, or it might be in the next sentence, but it will be within that phrase that there's a past tense verb and the pluperfect is before it. When we translate that into English, and we do use the pluperfect quite a lot in English, we might put the word had with it. So I had been to the shop, then I bought something, and then I came home. The verb bought there would be perfect. It's a completed action, or it might be aorist, a once-off action. But the I had been to the shop would be a pluperfect, an event that happened before the past tense verb. So that means that the pluperfect happened before anything else and was finished. The aorist tense happened once. The perfect happened for a while and is now complete. The imperfect was happening and continues to. The present tense is ongoing and happening right now, and if it only happened once, an aorist would be used in the present tense to tell us, and the future is used as a tense that tells us about what is yet to come. To have a little think about what that would look like in English words, I made a simple statement here about belief and coming to faith. The pluperfect to start with. At one time, I had been an unbeliever. Then one day, once off, I had a profound encounter, an encounter with God. That's aorist, it was once off. Then I came to faith. The perfect tense, it was something that was happening over a period of time and has now been completed. I was believing. I was believing in God. The imperfect started in the past tense and is continuing. Now I continue to believe. That's present tense. And by using the word continue rather than just saying now I believe, I've emphasized that there is continuity. So it is continuous present. And lastly, last on the timeline, the future. I will go on believing. Today we are looking specifically at the perfect tense, something that was begun in the past and has been brought to completion either in the past or at any point up until the present. Whereas the pluperfect, also a form of perfect tense, is something that was begun before that past tense verb and was brought to completion before the next event happened. Sometimes the fact that a perfect tense verb is used is very significant. When we think about doctrine and theology, for example, around things like soteriology, which means the doctrine of salvation, or eschatology, the study about the end times, using a tense like that to convey events that have happened and been completed, like Jesus saving us, his once-off atonement, sacrifice for our sin, and taking our place and taking our sins, we could use those tenses like aorist and perfect to signify completion of those events, or we could use a tense like the imperfect or the present continuous to convey ongoing actions and consequences of verbal actions. So these are very significant in the New Testament. The perfect tense is used as a past tense that was ongoing up until a point, and it describes completed actions. You will see this quite a lot in the epistles, but also in the Gospels, and in the only history book of the New Testament, the book of Acts. Also, the perfect tense is used where the results of the action of the verb are in effect up until the present. So I say the result is in effect. It's a completed event, and we are seeing the results now in the present tense. Let's just think about aspect, because that can be quite important in terms of what we're going to take out. So when you're doing a Bible study or a sermon, don't just think about where the verb is on the timeline, but think about its aspect. Or to put it another way, if I was to tell you to go to a certain place on a hill, the tense is like the position on the hill, and the aspect is like the view that you will get once you get there. Think about that when you are translating, when you are analyzing a Bible study to do a sermon or a Bible study. So the present tense has that continuous aspect, and often there will be some sort of progression as a result of continuous verb action. An example of the present tense, I am believing, or I believe, and there would be, you would expect an outcome, and it may be said in the sentence, I believe and therefore I go to church. The future has no defined aspect. The tense simply puts it into the yet to happen on the events timeline. I will believe. I will be believing. I will believe in future. Imperfect is a past tense that has a process to it. It's continuous. So we might translate that as I was believing. It doesn't say that you've stopped. It says that it started in the past and is still going on. Whereas the aorist, it happened once in the past, but it doesn't have a defined aspect. So we regard this one as undefined in its aspect because it doesn't tell us the results of the verb action. It just tells us the verb action. Whereas the perfect tells us about the completion. So the aspect is that it is completed. Now, I am giving you a pretty simple overview of this. If you want to find out more, then do check that out. The HellenisticGreek.com, I know, has a good section on it. The book, one of the books I looked at by Jeremy Duff, Elements of New Testament Greek. The books by Bill Mounts, for example. There's a bit more to learn. If you want to go on to study Koine Greek academically, then you might want to look a bit deeper. But for now, I'm just going to focus on the basics and giving people an overview so that you can use the software, interlinear Bibles, concordances, and things like that to study the Bible for yourself. And we'll come back in more depth at a later point. Here's a good example in the New Testament, 1 John 1, verse 3. Here's some perfect tense verbs for you. What we have seen and what we have heard, we proclaim to you also. So you've got two things that have been done in the past and completed. We have seen, we have heard. And then a present tense outcome from that, we proclaim to you also. Right, let's have a little look at the perfect tense then and look at how it declines, how it is laid out with the inflections for number and person. So here we have first, second and third person singular, and then first, second and third person plural. So using the example of the verb luo, as I have done before, it doesn't actually appear in all of these forms, but it's often used as an exemplar to show you how verbs decline. If luo had all these forms, it would look like this. Leluka, lelukas, leluke, adding the nu sound, leluken, if the next word begins with a vowel. And then in the plural, we, you, and they, lelukamen, lelukata, lelukasin. So what is happening here to make these changes? Well, firstly, we've got an epsilon augment like other indicative verbs that are in the past tense. But for the perfect, we also double the first consonant sound. Sometimes it's a vowel that gets doubled, but usually it's the consonant at the beginning of the verb that gets doubled. And a kappa goes on the end of the verb stem before the ending, a bit like we had a sigma for the aorist tense. It also has a thematic alpha which follows that kappa in almost all cases except the third person singular, he, she, or it. So have a look again. Now I've explained those rules to you, and you may well want to hit pause here. I'm going to be going over things quite quickly. You might want to pause on this or any of the next coming slides if you need a little bit more time. I try and keep these videos under 30 minutes, so I will move through the slides fairly quickly. Be ready with that pause button if you need it. So leluka, lelukas, lelukan. These endings echo the endings that we've seen before, but adding the consonant, doubling of the consonant, so l becomes lel with the extra epsilon, and then similar endings after the kappa, and the plural looks very much the same. Lelukamen, lelukata, lelukasin. So the endings are either very similar to other tenses or exactly the same to other tenses. Just remember those three things that are being added: the doubling of the first consonant, the epsilon augment, and the kappa. And in most cases, of course, we also have a thematic alpha. So here's a good example a bit further on in the letter of 1 John. We have several uses of the perfect tense. The one who does not believe in God has made him out to be a liar, or in the ESV translation, has made him a liar, because he has not believed in the testimony which God has borne witness to regarding his Son. So we have several uses of the perfect tense there. The first one, does not believe, that's present. But then has made him, God, out to be a liar, that's perfect. Because he has not believed, that's perfect. And the bit God has borne witness to his Son, that's also a perfect. Here I've underlined the perfect tenses, and often we use the verb to have, so has made, he has not believed, God has borne witness to. We use that quite often to convey a perfect tense. Now, in beginner's level Greek, I don't tend to just put up the Greek on the screen without showing you the phonetic pronunciations and the English translation. But in this case, I'm just putting these up to see if you can spot them straight away. Remember the epsilon augment, the doubling of the first consonant sound, and the kappa will give you clues that they are perfects, and the endings will give you clues that they are verbs. I wonder if you can spot them. Hit pause again if you need to. So here I've underlined them. The first one has made, pepoieken. So the poieo, the first sound has got doubled with an epsilon in between, pep, and then a kappa has been added to poieo to become poieken, pepoieken. Then the next one has a negative before it, u, so it's going to be not doing the verb, pepistuken. So from pistuo we get pepistuken, doubling of the first sound there with an epsilon, and a ken, again third person singular verb ending there, pepistuken. And then eistein marturian, about the testimony. So there's the noun form of the word testimony, and then the word testify. God has testified. Memartureken. You may recognize that as the word martyr, meaning to bear witness, to testify about something. Me martu reken, he has borne witness. God, peri tu huiu altu, about the son of him, God's son. There are words obviously that have a kappa in their stem, but quite often when you see a kappa on the page, it's an indication that there is a perfect tense there. If you see it's followed by a verbal ending and it has the beginning with the doubling of the first letter and the epsilon augment, then you know that it's going to be a perfect tense. Now there are, as ever, verbs that do not behave by these rules, and it may be that the kappa and the verbal ending are the only things that you see, and it doesn't have the epsilon augment and doubling at the beginning, or it may be that the endings are a little bit different because it's a second aorist. Remember also, second aorists have different stems. It might be that the verb stem is different. It might be that as it goes into the perfect tense, the verb actually changes back to be looking a lot more like the present tense. That varies a little bit, and these differences have come about because of regional differences in ancient Greek. But remember that in Koine Greek, in the New Testament at least, that verbs are either first aorist or second aorist. In wider Koine Greek and ancient Greek, they can happen in both the first aorist and second aorist, but that is not the case in the New Testament. They will be one or the other. Second aorist is not as there's not as many of them, but they are quite common. The ones that are actually there are commonly used. So it's simply that you've got to remember some extra stems there if you want to be able to read the Bible for yourself. But just to be aware that there are some different ones. I will go more in depth with this later on. This verse is pretty classic in the way that it uses the present and then perfect tense. So we see the believing bit is a participle in this case, which we are yet to come to. We will come on to that, but it's something that is ongoing in the present. And in this case, it's got may before it, which is a negative, an adversative, so it's not believing. And then it says has not believed, and there is the present reality is an outcome as a result of this completed action that started in the past. So let's also just have a little look at the pluperfect. What happens here is we get two epsilon augments. So there's still the doubling of the first consonant, and sometimes it's a vowel that gets doubled, but usually there's a consonant and they're getting doubled. The other epsilon augment goes before that consonant to show us that it is before the perfect tense, where there's already an epsilon showing us that it's in the past. So instead of starting with lel, we'll get ll, and then a kappa at the end of the stem in the same way, because it's still a type of perfect tense. But the thematic alpha is no longer there. Instead, we get epsilon iota, which is a diphthong pronounced a, and that is there in all cases, in all persons, and in singular and in plural. It has its own set of endings there, pretty much identical to the present tense, actually, but you'll get the kappa, the double epsilon augment, and the doubling of the first consonant. So you'll get a beginning that looks a bit like ll or erer or epep, and then an a sound with epsilon iota on the ending. Let's have a look at what they look like. And it's not actually very common, you won't get it in all of these forms, of course, but here is what it would sound like using luo as the example. Ellelucain, ellelucase, elleluke, ellelucamen, ellelucate, ellelucasan. John 6:17 gives some good examples of the use of pluperfects. Kai embantes eis pluion e conto, peran tes thalassaes kephaneum. So they get into a boat and set out across the lake or the sea to Kephaneum, or Capernaum in English. Kai Scotia Ada, so it's already dark. Egegone, there's the pluperfect. It had already become dark. Ke hupo eleluthe prosautus ho Jesus, and not yet he had come to them, Jesus. So we would translate that, and Jesus had not yet come to them. So they start out in the boat towards Capernaum, and darkness had already descended, it had already become dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. Then it's going to go on to talk about that very famous verse where Jesus walks on water, of course. But it's set the context by giving us a couple of pluperfects there, and to say what happened before, it's going to tell us another past tense verb. Just look at that in English. And having got into the boat, they started out across the sea to Capernaum, and it had already become dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. Just look back at the Greek again. We've got egegone and eleluthe. There's not a lot of pluperfects in the New Testament. As I said, it only happens 86 times with 31 different words, but these are the most common ones. I think eleluthe, in all its different numbers and persons, happens 15 times is the most common, and egegone from ginomai is the second most common verb to be used as a pluperfect. But here are two pretty classic examples. You can see the first consonant, a gamma in egegone and a lambda in eleluthe, has become doubled, and there's two epsilon augments in there. In eleluthe, the epsilon augment has gone in on top of another vowel, so it's lengthened that vowel to become an eta. So instead of elel, it's eleluthe. Sometimes when you have a second aorist, you're not going to get the kappa, but usually you get a kappa with the pluperfect. Now here, I've put this word down. The different colours show some different things. So the white, the lu, is the stem of the word. Just two letters. We've added the augments of two separate epsilons and doubled the first consonant to make it perfect, and then pluperfect with another, with the extra epsilon. The kappa, which goes with all perfect tense verbs, there I've highlighted in pink. And then the ending, which gives us the inflection as to what person and number, is ein, epsilon, iota, nu. In this case, it's first person singular, so it's I had come. That ending can occur in the present active infinitive, so you'll see it for that reason. But as you can see on the screen, it's very clear which verb it's going to be, because the pluperfect would add a great deal more. You have the kappa, you have the epsilon, you have the doubling of the first consonant or vowel sound, and then you have another epsilon as well. So you shouldn't ever confuse the two, but do just be aware that epsilon, iota, nu can occur in the infinitive as an ending as well. As we finish, let's just look at some of the most common examples and see how they work out. Now, I will produce also a principal parts list that will show lots of verbs, the most common ones, and how they are in their main forms, including the different tenses and moods that we use. And then you can work out from there how they're going to decline. But let's just look at a few of the most common. So here is the word horao, which we get words like horology and horoscope from. It is the verb to see. Now, in Greek, we do have a few different verbs that could be used, same in English. Difference between see and look, for example. Horao is to see something of, and it's often used in the context of seeing and believing, seeing and understanding, or being able to see, as in being able to understand something. So in the aorist, because it's a second aorist, horao becomes eidon, completely different. But the perfect tense is based on that form in the present tense, horao. So an epsilon gets added on, and there's a doubling of the first sound. In this case, an omicron gets doubled, so two omicrons, two o sounds, becomes a long o with the epsilon augment as well. So e-o, ra is in there. So you still got basically an o, an r, and an a sound in there. O, ra, and then to give the inflection for first person singular, it would be ka, o, ra, ka. And because it has a hard breathing, there's an H sound on that epsilon, heoraka. So the word is heoraka. And this one does actually have a pluperfect, heorake. You can see the only difference is that there's a change in the endings, because it wouldn't. We've already got 3 vowel sounds being pushed onto the beginning of that with the epsilon augment and the long vowel, which is basically like 2 vowels. So we're not going to add another one there. That wouldn't really make sense. So it's heorake in Acts 7:44 for he had seen, and the perfect I have seen is heoraka. Again, do hit pause if you need to with these. Akuo, I hear. This is used in active, middle and passive voices, so it's a good one to remember and to analyze here. So we start with akuo, I hear. And in the aorist, adding the epsilon to the alpha made it an eta. So we have akusa with the sigma and then the thematic alpha. So I heard, akusa. Again, the perfect is going to be based on the present tense. We have ake ko'a, doubling of the consonant, the kappa, and the additional epsilon has gone in on top of the alpha to lengthen it into an eta. The first sound, ak, has been doubled, so ake ko'a. The epsilon has been pushed out in this case. There's complex rules as to why that happens. We'll come back to that in more detail, but just be aware that that can happen at this stage. Also, it's worth noting where the accents are. So in the aorist, it's a kusa with an emphasis on the a, and the accent still stays on that long a sound in the perfect tense, but it's not at the beginning anymore. So it's ake ko'a. And I think that these pronunciations would have been very significant for people hearing the language to be able to pick up on the tenses. There isn't a pluperfect of this, but here's an example of it as a passive. It could be the same if it was in the middle voice as well, because in the present tense the passive and middle voice look the same. But there you have akuomai. So that's a present passive or middle of I hear, akuomai. Urkomai, another one, again hit pause if you need to, is a second aorist as well. This is one of the most common verbs in the New Testament again. The verb to come or to go I've used various times in my other videos, and as I've said before, is a second aorist that becomes aorthon in its aorist form. So again, it looks very different to its present tense form, but is a very common word. So aorthon, I came. Now in this one, the perfect is actually based on the second aorist form, not the present tense form. Is a deponent verb that only has a middle voice in the present tense, but in its past tenses they're actually active. In the perfect it becomes elelutha. So the verb to come or to go, elelutha, I have come. Often where you see a theta before the verb ending, it's a passive verb. But in this case, the theta, as you see in the aorist there, is part of the second aorist stem, and it's not actually part of the ending. This is not a passive, this is an active. And as we saw with that example of Jesus about to walk on water, there is a pluperfect. In fact, there's several pluperfect examples of the verb erchomai. It's the most common to take the pluperfect form. Eleleuthein. Again, it's still got the theta because it's part of the spelling. Eleleuthein in the pluperfect. I had come, or in the context we just saw with Jesus, had not yet come, with an adversative, he, third person singular. And then the verb to say, lego, which is another second aorist. So apon, very common word. It's again a different form with a different second aorist stem, and it becomes apon. The perfect builds upon that rather than the present tense form to give us areka, for I have said. It's worth bearing in mind also, just want to note that there are two slightly different forms of the third person plural in the New Testament. In Acts chapter 17 it's arekasin, but in Revelation chapter 19 it's arekan. So the difference is just that it in Revelation doesn't have the sigma iota. I would imagine that this contraction has simply happened for ease, out of laziness maybe, because all languages tend to become easier over time, because that's human nature. We do things the easiest way we can, and so Greek, as it's evolved from ancient Greek to Koine Greek, tends to simplify a bit, but it's reasonably easy in this case to spot the parsing, and for most of you you'll be using apps and software to do the parsing for you anyway, so just understand that it's going to happen. Last point there, there's a pluperfect for this one, arekain, but it's not actually used in the New Testament. Arekain, I had said, is what it would have been. You will find that in ancient Greek, but it's not used in the New Testament. So I'm just going to finish this video by giving you a quick summary of what we've learned. The perfect tense is a past tense that started in the past and has been brought to completion. That completion could have occurred at any point right up until the present. It was ongoing for a period of time and has been brought to its conclusion. And it's very commonly used in the New Testament. We see it in participles, infinitive and indicative moods. The perfect tense adds an epsilon like other past tense in the indicative mood, and it doubles the first sound, usually a consonant. It doubles the first sound. It can sometimes be a vowel or a vowel with a consonant, but it's usually a consonant. It has a kappa at the end of the stem that begins the ending, which gives us the inflection as to number and person. And the pluperfect then adds another epsilon augment before that and has present tense endings, usually after the kappa. It's very rare, and don't forget that some second aorists don't really play by the rules and will be a little bit different. But this video has given you an overview of the basic formation of the perfect tense and why it is used. Thanks for watching this video. Do check out the practice videos on past tenses and for the perfect tense as well. I'll be uploading more. practice videos. There'll be practice videos to go with all of these explainer videos. Do click on the links on screen, which will give you some suggestions as to what to watch next, whether you want to do the practice or whether you want to go on to the explainer for the next section. After this, we're going to cover a bit more about middle and passive voices of some of these past tense verbs that we've been looking at over the last few weeks before finishing up our level 2. Thank you for coming along. Do pop any comments you have into the comments section, or any questions that you might have. If you'd like to get updates as to when videos are uploaded, then do click on subscribe. There's no charge for this. It just will give you an indication. And make sure you go to your settings and tell YouTube how to give you notifications. And if you want to like the videos, then that helps me to get more hits when people search for New Testament, learning New Testament as well. And do give me any feedback you have as to how to improve this channel. Thank you for coming along, and I hope the Lord continues to bless you as you go about learning how to read the New Testament in its original language. Goodbye and God bless.